Wow. Step 5. Okay, we'll call our committee meeting to order. This is a meeting of the Orono Town Council Comprehensive Plan Committee. My name is Tom Perry. I'm chairman of the council, and I will shortly turn the meeting over to Megan Gardner, who facilitates our Comprehensive Plan Committee. Our roll call shows that Councilor Gardner, Councilor Ocher, and Councilor Hubler are present. I expect Councilor Wingard to join us shortly, and he'll be here. The other 3 councilors are joining us by Zoom. So it's a hybrid meeting. And just to talk a minute about logistics, this is a committee meeting, so no formal council action will be taken. Rather, there may be some recommendations to move something forward to the regular council meeting occurring in October. During these committee meetings, it is up to the chair that's running the particular committee whether to allow comment from the public, so that'll be her discretion. The purpose of the meeting is for the council to better understand items that may go to the full council, to ask for some revision of these items, or to say they're not ready to go to full council. The Zoom chat function has been disabled for this meeting. We can't see it here in the council chambers, so it's kind of disruptive to have it going. However, any member of the public is more than welcome to contact council members by email. We've received a number of emails in the last couple of days, so people know how to get a hold of us. We will be taking any votes to move something forward will be hand vote. We won't be doing any roll call votes this evening. I will just do one more thing, and that is to remind everybody of the agreements that we have on how we run our meetings. And those are to be on time, come prepared, and stay present. Let everybody participate, don't interrupt, be brief, and don't repeat. Let everyone seek first to understand, ask questions so you can disagree without being disagreeable. Listen with an open mind, value and respect other points of view, and respectfully challenge ideas, not the person, and offer solutions. So with that introduction, I will turn the meeting over to Megan.
Thank you, Tom. And thank you for that kind of overview of the committee meeting process. Yes, so again, as I just want to reiterate, as Tom mentioned, we don't take formal action at committee meetings, and we also don't have formal public comment as part of committee meetings. We do sometimes, at the chair's discretion, hear from members of the public who attend. My inclination for this meeting is to not have public comment or input tonight. We received quite a lot of emails from residents, and we have been talking about this issue for a while. Some of us are familiar with the issue as residents ourselves, or property owners or landlords ourselves. We also were fortunate to have a good showing of landlords who came to speak with town staff and kind of talk through some of these issues. And we've, so thank you to everybody who gave feedback and comment. I would say that if folks are watching this meeting live or after the fact, and they do have more things to add or questions to ask, I really encourage you to contact council via email. We do also have a formal public comment section at every full council meeting. So either one of those or both avenues are open to the public. So again, just because of the time constraints and because there are so many people who may be interested in giving comment, to be fair and to keep us on track, I'm not going to have public comment tonight. But I do thank everyone who did already reach out and let us know what your thoughts were on this subject. Okay, so to dive in, we're going to start with item 2A, which is a review of draft ordinance revisions related to, and the first item that we'll be talking about is rental registration for long-term rental properties. I assume I'll be turning this over to our town planner, Kyle.
Yes. Hi, everyone. yeah, as the committee chair pointed out, we have a few draft ordinance amendments or revisions to go over on a few different topics. These were put into draft ordinance format, not because they're necessarily 100% ready to get recommended, into an adoption stage, but rather as sort of an easier way to comprehend them in the kind of grand scheme of the ordinance, rather than doing just a presentation, which can also kind of lead to more general, less specific conversations and kind of be harder to nail down what we're really trying to get at. So yeah, the first draft amendment is in regards to our rental registration ordinance article. The comprehensive plan had a few recommendations that had not yet been really considered by council. And so the purpose of this amendment is to sort of address a couple of those, as well as cleaning up the rental registration ordinance language to kind of better reflect the practice that we have today and we've had for a while now. So in the background material, you should have kind of gotten a summary of some of the changes and been able to look over anything. So I won't go too into detail on every line. I would say one of the specific recommended changes that came out of the comp plan was this idea of creating a provision for an absentee owner. So someone who lived outside of the kind of Orono area to provide for a local agent, some sort, to manage the property. And this was kind of directly a response to staff dealing with certain situations where it was hard to kind of take action in a timely manner when there were code issues or other potential violations happening at a property. Looking through the rental registration data that we have from the last year, you can see that most of the sort of property owners that would fall into that kind of absentee owner definition already have local property managers or local agents of some sort. So in a way, this is sort of taking the common practice and sort of codifying it and just applying it to all situations. In addition to that, we sort of kind of wanted to clear up some things that aren't really used too often. For instance, there was a lot of language in there about the kind of development of a rental property town advisory committee. And I think this was one of the things that came out of our kind of staff meeting when we met with several of the local landlords in town and property owners, was that this isn't necessarily something that needs to be codified in the ordinance, but it is something that could be considered and could be beneficial in some capacity as a practice. Just because something isn't in the ordinance doesn't mean we can't utilize it going forward. And we think that some sort of group that met on some sort of regularly occurring basis, however frequently, to kind of talk about different sorts of rental policy issues or nuisances that are coming up that seem to be common, or whatever it is, could be useful and beneficial both for property owners, renters, and town staff. So it's something that we think could be done as more of a practice, but isn't necessarily needed in the ordinance. It gives us a little more flexibility. And that's pretty much it. Other than that, it's more so clarifying dates around when registrations get sent out, when they're due, the sort of grace period before fines and violations take place. These are all things that have sort of been the practice of the department for a while now, but it's more so solidifying them in the ordinance language. So I'm happy to go over any questions with this ordinance amendment, but I think that pretty much covers the main themes.
Do councilors have any questions about this ordinance amendment? Or any comments? Sounds like no, I don't have any myself. I think this is all pretty reasonable. I think the idea of not ordinance codified, but useful working group that includes the town and the university and the landlords would be really beneficial, as well as the local agent. Okay, well, it sounds like we can move on to the next item here, which, sorry, my computer is not behaving well today, is item 2, or sorry, Roman numeral 2, short-term rental registration.
Okay, so the second kind of, does Councilor Mitchell have a question?
Sorry, I got confused how far into the document we were going. With regard to the registration, I guess forget it. I'll ask later.
Okay. Okay, so moving on, the next sort of item around rental activity that we've sort of talked about in the past, but never really finalized, and we sort of put it on the shelf for a little while, was the idea of short-term rentals. There's probably a few new council members since we started talking about this. But in general, for just a bit of a recap, our ordinance currently has something called a homestay, which is just our way of labeling a short-term rental. Some places call it vacation rental, short-term rental. It's all really synonymous. So the problem arose when our definition for homestay really only covered a very specific situation where it was an owner-occupied single-family home, and the person was renting out a couple bedrooms at most in the house. It was viewed as a type of traveler's accommodation, along with things like bed and breakfast and hotels, but it was also viewed as a type of home occupation, like any other home business, where there's the potential for some commercial activity in a residential structure. So this amendment keeps that sort of classification as a mixture of both traveler's accommodation and home occupation the same. But the key difference is that the definition for homestay here splits it into 2 types. And one is really an owner-occupied type. So the homestay 1 would be any homestay in an owner-occupied single-family home or a 2-family or multi-family dwelling in which one of the units is owner-occupied. Whereas a homestay 2 would be for those cases where the structure doesn't have an owner-occupant. And that was really a result of we started seeing people using things like Airbnb and those types of services becoming more widely used and utilized in town. And as town staff, we haven't really heard or received many, if any, complaints over this type of activity. And when we had talked previously with council, it seemed that in general, council wanted to allow these different types of short-term rental activities in these different sorts of occupied structures. But we needed to kind of bring our ordinance up to date with it. So that's what this is aiming to do. It sort of defines each one. In the case of an owner-occupied homestay, they would be able to operate via a permit through code enforcement. The homestay too, if it was, so in the non-owner occupied examples, if it was located in a residential district, it would be required to go before the planning board for site plan review, most likely an abbreviated site plan review, so it's not quite as intensive. And that's similar to how we treat home businesses. So the idea is that, yes, you can utilize this practice, but it recognizes that you're bringing in some, albeit small scale commercial activity to an otherwise residential neighborhood. And by sending that to site plan review, it brings in a few different review criteria that a project wouldn't have to go through if it was simply a permit through the code office. So it brings into question things like vegetated buffers on a property line. It takes a closer look at making sure adequate, you're providing for the adequate access to a parking area, or that a certain activity won't generate more than a certain amount of trips onto a small scale kind of residential street, things like that. And then within the kind of home occupation section of our ordinance, it creates a sort of section specific for homestays that's pretty empty right now, but it would give the council the opportunity in the future where if homestays became more of an issue and council wanted to regulate them more in the future, that sort of foundation would already be there. And it would be easier to amend the ordinance and just simply put in whatever additional standards were necessary at the time. So currently, the only things they're really talking about, the use of not being able to use recreational vehicles or tents or things that wouldn't be considered dwelling units normally in town for short-term rentals. But other than that, there isn't really any regulation proposed. That being said, that's kind of how it would work if council did kind of agree on some necessary actions. So that pretty much covers that one. Again, happy to go over anything in more detail, take any comments or questions.
Comments or questions? I do have one, but I'd like to hear from other folks first, if there are any. Lori?
I actually have something from the thing before. So after we're done discussing this, if we could hop back to the other one, it's just a question about the previous agenda item.
Sure. So Kyle, the only thing that I wondered is if you could just expand a little bit on item 2B, because the conversation around number of unrelated people in various types of rental properties is always important and also sometimes confusing for folks. So for the benefit of folks out there, the dwelling units that can be registered as long-term and also short-term and the number of unrelateds.
Okay. Right. So
like a complicated math problem.
Right. So what that 2B provision is kind of getting at is that if someone had a dwelling unit, a second unit in their house or an ADU or whatever it is, they could, and they weren't sure how they wanted to rent it going into the year. So they registered it as a long-term rental, but they also thought they might use it as a short-term rental, or maybe they live in their single-family home and they rent one bedroom out to a long-term tenant. So that's two people, and they're allowed 3 unrelated people in their zoning district, and they want to rent another bedroom out on a short-term basis. So that's basically saying the combined activity in the dwelling unit has to abide by that family definition. So in one dwelling unit, you can normally have 3 or 5 unrelated people, depending on the zoning district that you're in. So regardless of sort of the activity going on in that dwelling unit, whether it's the owner, a long-term rental, a short-term rental, that all has to add up to meet that 3 unrelated or 5 unrelated people. You can't have 3 unrelated for a long-term registered rental registration unit, and then an additional 3 for a short-term rental.
Excellent, thank you. Lori, the question about the first item? Lori, you're muted.
Sorry. Yes, thank you. There was a highlighted section in the notes under the previous one, which I think everything sounded great about the previous one. So I don't have anything that I want to change. I just wanted a point of information question. So in the note on 8-1114, local agent required. So we have been discussing this for quite a long time about why it would be in the best interest to better manage rental properties, to make sure that whoever owns them has someone within an hour's distance of Orono, or we originally started with nearby Orono, and then we put this hour thing. That makes a lot of sense to me. And nobody seemed to be questioning that. I'm not questioning it, but there's a note underneath that section that says, I'm quoting, looking at the 2021 rental registration data, there were a total of 25 property owners who would be considered absentee owners who did not have local manager or agent. And 12 of those were in-state, but beyond the hour time drive from Orono, or drive time from Orono, and 13 were out-of-state owners. But the majority of absentee owners, 48, did already have some local manager or agent. So that was great to hear that there were only 25. That doesn't actually, so what I'm missing is how many rental properties total do we have? And so if there were 25 owners that didn't have managers, this ordinance would cause them to have to do that, get a manager. How many properties? So there's property owners, or 25 people, but how many properties does that represent out of the total number of rental properties we have? And you may not have that data, those data, and it's just something that would be interesting to hear about.
Yeah, I could go back and get it. There were definitely, going through, I remember seeing, some of the same owners, being owners of multiple properties. I don't think it was, it wasn't a ton, where it was something like, oh, you have someone who would be considered an absentee owner, and they own something like, one of the big apartment complexes, which is hundreds of units, and they don't have a local manager. It's nothing like that. It might be a few properties, or, but yeah, I can get that information and bring it back next time.
Well, but I just want to say thanks for giving us the information you did, because it's nice to see that really there's only, at least at the last count, there's only 25 property owners who'd have to change how they're already managing. And the goal of these ordinance changes is to try to make, make things better in Orono. And we've acknowledged it's usually only a few properties that we are encouraging management to be better. So I think this is only 25 owners, and probably it's not that many properties. So anyway, thanks for getting me that information.
I think also it's important to note that in addition to that, this ordinance language would prevent, I know there's fears out there among residents of larger firms, maybe even just in Portland, or not even like down in New York, who do huge housing complexes, but like that firms could be buying up properties in neighborhoods to try to turn them into college housing, and then kind of be absentee. But this is kind of preventing that as well, which is great. Are we ready to move on to our next? I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. My agenda is just like stuttering every time I try to scroll. Let me pull this back up here. Were there any other questions before we move on? Okay, so no questions or feedback, any additional feedback about short-term rentals? Okay, so disorderly property and unruly gatherings.
Can I interrupt here for just a minute?
Sure.
Kyle, could you just take a minute to talk about your different approach to unruly gatherings and disorderly property before you get into the meat of the ordinance?
Yeah. Oh, and I also want to note real quick that item 4 that is supposed to come after this on the agenda is actually part of what we're about to discuss as well. So those won't be two separate things. The fee for police services is actually folded into item Roman numeral 3 in this section. Correct. Yeah. The way our existing ordinance is laid out in this law enforcement chapter is that Article 2 was previously for recovery costs for police services at large events. And then Article 3 was for disorderly property. And what this amendment did, so we're looking at the amendment titled Proposed Amendment to Orono Law Enforcement Ordinance to create standards for unruly gatherings. So the kind of general framework that this is trying to create is to, in Article 2, not just talk about large events and recovery for police services, fees for police services. That's sort of lumped into this bigger picture unruly gatherings article. So this is meant to kind of take action when there is a larger scale gathering of some sort. The way that large events were previously defined in this section, where I think either 5 or 6 people. And when we were looking at that, that seemed kind of small for something that was considered a large event. Whereas we already have the disorderly property ordinance sort of in place that can handle something of that scale. So the disorderly property article is really meant to handle sort of the smaller scale problems that might come up at a property, while the unruly gathering kind of Article 2 is meant to handle larger scale issues and sort of events that take place. You know, it would probably be more likely that these are less frequent, but it allows town officials to kind of deal with them more directly than what was in the ordinance before under the previous Article 2. Whereas the disorderly property ordinance now in Article 3, we really tried to kind of tone it down a little bit in terms of the very specific and kind of complicated record tracking that was needed before into something more simple that allowed for the police department to potentially work with people more, specifically the people who were responsible for whatever disorderly activity was going on. Part of our conversation with some of the local landlords and property owners was that whether you have a local landlord, you know, talking about these absentee owners, whether you have a local property manager, or whether the owner, you know, lives in town already, it's impossible sometimes for them to be there 24 hours a day, monitoring behavior all the time. So for these sort of disorderly activities, disorderly events that can compile into a disorderly property, the idea was to really kind of target the behavior of the responsible person and sort of work through them, you know, work with them
a couple times before really getting into that, okay, now it's happened several times and it's sort of on the property owner or the local agent to kind of come up with a plan and work through it with police. So yeah, so that I guess sort of summarizes the whole thing. Probably got too specific there. But so to go into a little more detail, the first piece of the amendment is repealing the previous Article 2. And it's talking about the specific, larger scale unruly gatherings, which are defined as a gathering of 20 or more people. So that's sort of a different way of looking at it than before, where it was more in that like 5 or 6 range. However, you move on to the next section, it sort of gives the police department or the police officer responding to the unruly gathering kind of clear authority to deal with the matter when they show up, whereas there was language in the previous section about needing to provide a written warning and then come back if it's not dealt with. Well, when a gathering of that size is sort of, I guess, steamrolling out of control potentially, the comprehensive plan kind of specifically recommended making that process more efficient for town officials to respond to kind of try to put an end to it right away instead of kind of dragging it on and making it more difficult to deal with when there's a clear recognized problem going on. The kind of article then goes on to talk about notice of the gathering. So afterwards, notice is provided to the property owner. The responsible parties in the case of the unruly gatherings could be the property owner, the persons who organized it, or anyone in attendance, really depending on the gathering at hand. The penalty section, so the amounts for the fines and the fees for police services, that's something that was mostly based on previous conversations around this topic that town staff had with council that I wasn't necessarily involved in. I think those numbers are subject to change and discussion. This is meant more of a kind of a starting point to just kind of get the general idea down as to whether kind of looking at these different scales of issues in this way makes sense. But happy to take any feedback on that. So then it also lumps the fee for police services kind of into this section instead of having an entire section dedicated to itself. And that's if any medical expenses or personal property for the town was impacted in any way in responding to the unruly gathering. So then moving on to the disorderly property amendment, it keeps a lot of the existing language the same. The first real key difference is the way that we define a disorderly property. Previously, if you look at the section that's struck through, it talks about a property that had 2 disorderly events in 60 days, 3 in 120 days, 4 in 180 days. It required a lot of probably unnecessary record keeping in a sort of convoluted way by the police department to determine when something was and wasn't technically a disorderly property, even though multiple disorderly events were happening. So we tried to make that more simple and clear in just saying, if you have 3 disorderly events in the span of a year, starting July 1, that you would be classified as a disorderly property. And once you have those disorderly events, the first one is sort of you're issued a warning. The officer responding to an event would already have issued that warning. So really you just kind of keep that practice in place. And then the property owner would be notified that a warning was given. The second disorderly event, the responsible party, whether it's a tenant or the person who owns a property, whoever it is, would be required to set up a meeting with relevant town staff, whether it's the police department or code or whoever it is, to sort of have an educational kind of talk to get more of the context as to why what they're doing is really kind of negatively impacting the neighborhood or whatever it is. And then finally, after a third disorderly event in that year, then you would have to go to sort of the existing language on a remediation agreement where the property owner is really then becoming responsible and has to work with the police department on coming up with an agreement and a plan of action to move forward and address the sort of several disorderly behaviors that have gone on previously. I think that's the general idea. There's some small changes as far as notifying property owners, reaching them in more ways than just mail and certified mail, addressing them, the notice of violations or notice of disorderly events through email or phone, whether through the rental registration or other records, to kind of come up with a more timely kind of notice that one of these disorderly events has taken place. But other than that, I think that pretty much covers the general idea of what we were going for. This one's a little more complicated in the way it's laid out than the other two. So I'm happy to go into more depth if I didn't explain something right.
Lori?
We were sent an addendum to the agenda, which included the incidents let's see, what was it called? Master disorderly data. I think that's what it was called. Now I've clipped out of it. Well, it had 5 different types of events. Are you saying any one of those events goes into an event that's registered that would be considered one of the 3? I guess it was Sophie's email was unruly gathering / disorderly event data 2016 to 2021. And the data had in the key, there were 5 different kinds of disorderly events. A is loud music, B, boisterous gathering, C, excessive loud or unnecessary noises audible beyond the property line, D, altercations occurring on the property such as fighting, disorderly conduct, brawling or similar activities, and E was other similar activities occurring within or outside any building located on the property, which I also had a question about how E was actually different than the others, because it says other similar activities. But
right.
But anyway, so those, when you say 3 incidents, then they go into a different category. Is it any of these, A through E, or does it have to be ones that are the more excessive, like C, D, and E?
Right. So those, I think, letters on that Excel sheet are taken directly from the ordinance, the existing ordinance language. So if you go to section 2053, definitions, A is disorderly activities. That sort of lists out all of those different activities. And I think that's where they pulled that from and how to identify it. I didn't really look at changing that language at this point. So if there is a redundancy in the way something's worded, it's something we could look at and consider, but hadn't gotten to that yet.
So there is a difference between outside the building and outside the property line. You look at the large complexes, We are getting complaints from within the property, but outside the building.
Was that the extent of your question, Lori, or?
No, actually, thank you, Sophie, for clarifying. So C mentions the property line and E mentions any building located on the property. So what you're saying is that E then can apply to when we have multiple units that are in a same complex.
Right, that could apply to more of our clustered developments and things like that, rather than just you know, a single structure property, I think.
Okay, so I understand how they're separate things, but something about the wording wasn't that clear when I read it the first time, and maybe if I had read it in the ordinance, I would see that. But so I'm just flagging that, you know, I may not be the only one who doesn't see it as clear the first time through. And then, but the question I had is, while you were discussing this, you said 3 incidents, and so my question was, are those anything A through E, or those incidents only the more, you know, only the C, D, and E, which are, you know, a little bit bigger than loud music or boisterous gatherings?
So it's anything that is determined by the police chief to be a disorderly event. So if an officer responds to one of those 5 or 6 disorderly activities, they sort of make a report of that, as I understand it, and then it's deemed whether or not it actually was a valid complaint, or there was actually something going on, and that's when it would be classified as a disorderly event by the police chief. If it's classified as a disorderly event, that's when any of those could add up to those 3 that would qualify it as a disorderly property.
Thank you.
Sure.
Are there other questions? I have a question, but Tom or Laura, is there anything you'd like to ask Kyle? Laura?
Yeah, a bunch of different things. I guess overall, and what I gathered from the comp plan, and what we've been here, I feel like there are a couple different issues that we're dealing with regard to rentals. Obviously, there's multiple ordinances here, but like there's issues that we're seeing in large complexes, and then there's neighborhood issues that we're seeing. And the scale and scope of those issues vary quite considerably. And so I feel like this is starting to get at some of the concerns around the large places. However, I think the fees are low and are not at a deterrence level, but just at a cover cost level, which, so for that type of large response, I think the fees should be higher. The issue of mixing rentals into small neighborhoods, and we heard from a number of residents that are challenged, and I've talked to a number of people that are concerned about safety, health, welfare, livability, with the mixing in residential neighborhoods of homes that have been turned into rentals and the increasing numbers of those. I don't think we've hit the nail on the head to fix that at all. And I think there are some bigger picture issues when we think about the market forces that have allowed us to get to where we are. They aren't serving the best interests of this community. And that was called out in the comp plan, wanting more families that will invest and keep up their properties and have kids that are in school and pay for and use and support the resources of this town. And so I'm concerned that we're missing the boat in addressing those issues. And so I see that next on the agenda, we're going to talk about how some of the comp plan goals that are those bigger issues and what we've done. So these comments, I guess I would have liked to have heard that first to kind of line all this together in my mind. But I don't necessarily have a problem with anything that's going on here, but I feel like we still have a big gap to address. And I want to hear more about that. I'm also concerned that I can see there's people in the room that obviously like want to have a voice. I know staff has talked to landlords. And so I'm concerned that we're not giving residents access and that voice to talk about their thoughts and concerns as well. The one thing that I did notice was stuff about parking, and this might be able to be addressed in this versus fall into a gap. But if there was some kind of guidelines around the number of parking spaces per rental that were off-road, I think that might help address some of the clearly over the 3 unrelated people living in one home issue that we know is going on all over town. And think about how do we enforce some of this early in, I guess it was in the first ordinance that we looked at. It speaks to this being a registry and not a license, and the town has not made any determination that the property is fit for human habitation or it's in compliance with any codes, ordinance, statutes, or regulations. And I think we need to start thinking about how do we peel back the onion layer on some of that stuff so we can have a higher level of enforcement and quality of life, particularly in some select neighborhoods where we know there's a high level of conflict of quality of life and safety going on. And we got a lot of emails today. We know this is happening in our community. So I think those were my key points for right now.
Tom, it's awful hard for me to see what's going on with you over there. Do you have any questions or comments to add about the ordinance revision?
No, I'm fine with what's happened so far.
Okay. My only question, Kyle, was just to, I think it would help me thinking about both unruly gatherings and disorderly properties and disorderly events, and the fee structure. I understand, if I'm reading this correctly, that with a lot of those fees, they compound as they go, right? So it might look like, okay, the fee is $1,000 fine, but then if there's another one within a certain time frame, that doubles to $2,000. If there's another one within the time frame, that $2,000 doubles to $4,000, right? So it does compound as it goes. Is that correct?
Correct, yes.
Okay. So it can get very high in the case of, a large scale housing complex, for example, having repeated offenses. What would help me understand, I think, is all the fees and the warnings and the notifications between the two, it seems like there could be overlay or overlap. And I guess maybe it would help me if like a real world, for instance, of who gets fined and when, and who has to come up with a plan for the property. And does that make sense? Like the steps because the way I'm reading it, it seems like, okay, well, there's a warning, but also you could get fined for police services on that day or not. I guess I'm my brain is more of a storyteller brain. So I'm trying to imagine like a real world, like for instance, how these fine structures and other warnings and things would work.
Sure. So I think in the case of the unruly gatherings that when the first gathering takes place, that's when an officer could go and abate the gathering, and that section 2029 notice of unruly gathering you know, finding out who is responsible for that gathering, that's when the penalty section in 2031, you know, that could, you know, if whoever the responsible party was, you know, that penalty section could apply to them there. The police services fee, you know, that was kind of taken from what was in the ordinance previously and kind of lumped into this, is saying if the police has to come back a second time to that same gathering or a subsequent gathering a week later or a month later, whatever it is, you know, that's when those additional fees for police services might apply. You know, we could look at possibly making that more clear and making sure that, like you're talking about, the process is lined out more so it makes sense. I mean, like I said, this was more of a kind of first stab at trying to kind of lay out kind of an overarching foundation of addressing the kind of different scale of problems. So, you know, I haven't discussed much with the, you know, other town staff in depth beyond kind of the bigger picture theories. So yeah, I'd be interested to kind of go through this with everyone, police department, you know, police chief, town manager, everyone, to kind of make sure that the process makes sense and everything.
Okay, yeah, because I'm thinking like in real world terms, like, okay, we have a house at 123 America Street, right?
Yep.
We're having a big wild party. So in theory, from what we're reading here, the police would show up, they would say, you are having a big, loud, unruly gathering and you need to stop. These are the rules and this is what's going to happen if you don't stop. And then they go. At that point, could the people having the gathering be fined, or are they just being warned at that point?
Right.
Or is that up for debate and discussion?
I can tell you from practice, Megan, police show up, give a warning to disperse, and we don't begin to enact the other elements. And the warning that would go through this if it's a disorderly event. Most of the time, if the police show up and people disperse, unless it is a huge gathering, we would not kind of go through. The fee for police service is really based on, if we go back a second time and we have to sit there while we wait for people to disperse, more in the 10.5 years I've been here, the only time I've used this ordinance is with the large housing complexes, and it is where we are getting invoiced for thousands of dollars of response from the 30 responding officers throughout the region. So, I think when you look at this, they kind of lay in together. Our goal as we work through this is to get the gotcha out of it and to do more education following the model that we've kind of set up with our community policing structure. But I mean, just because that was staff's idea doesn't mean it's necessarily the right one.
And thank you for that. And so, so in theory, if the unruly gathering reconvened later on that evening, police have to come back. At that point, the people responsible for the gathering could be fined and also be billed for police response. Is that correct? Based on the way that this is written? Okay. And also at the same time, that would trigger the notice to the landlord, though the landlord is not being held responsible, but a notice that this has happened. But a second instance would then somehow involve the landlord.
So I think you Might be
I might be
getting
confusing
the
myself.
disorderly property and the unruly gatherings. So with the disorderly property, the fine doesn't really happen until, so the 3 steps in disorderly property is sort of, you know, first event, it's a warning. Second event, it's that sort of educational meeting. There's still no fines involved. The property owner is notified every event, but you're really working with, you're warning the responsible party, you're meeting with the responsible party to talk it through. You're just notifying the property owner or local property manager. The third disorderly event is when the owner is brought in and you need to develop some sort of remediation agreement. And I think at that point, if the agreement goes through and you resolve the issues, and I think you know, the police chief can say, okay, it's no longer a disorderly property. You know, you've satisfied all of the conditions of this agreement. If that agreement isn't created or it's not addressed, or more disorderly property events sort of come up, that's when the disorderly property at that point, I think, could face a civil penalty as far as the ordinance goes. With the unruly gathering, it's, you know, first event, you could get that unruly gathering penalty. If it happens a subsequent gathering, then in addition to the penalty for unruly gathering, that's when the police services could kick in. And yeah, in both cases, the owner would be notified. And I think it would depend on the circumstances whether or not the owner was found to be a responsible party or not.
Okay, and so in some ways, you know, the way that this is drafted, it would potentially give a fair amount of discretion to town staff to determine kind of what the right path would be in terms of how to address based on the circumstances of the gathering or the property. Is that what am I correct in that? Okay.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
it's a bigger toolkit.
Right. I think the goal is, you know, more efficiency in being able to respond to a kind of large scale issue and more flexibility in working with people rather than just, here's the fine, stop doing it. And then not really kind of doing anything beyond that.
And then ... And if you don't stop doing it, then
right,
you will just get lots of fines.
right. And yeah, you were correct with the unruly gatherings, that sort of exponential doubling of the fine. Right. It would end up being much more for the larger, you know, complexes versus, you know, a medium scale kind of multi-family development versus a 2-family home versus a, you know, single family home or whatever.
And with, like, for example, when we talk about the difference between, you know, are we finding that the responsible party is the person who lives there and through the gathering, or are we saying that the property owner or landlord is somehow part of that responsibility? When it comes to, like, for example, the large housing complexes, would potentially the determination there be something like the situations we may have seen in the past where we say, like, you need to have, you know, a presence, security presence, and they are negligent in that aspect? Is that sort of part of how we would determine whether they're roped into the fine structure or whether it's just on the residents themselves? Or
the town, as a matter of practice, has held tenants and property owners jointly and severally liable for these fees. As a matter of practice, I would much rather see us be assessing fines to landlords who are actively not trying to stop something from happening. And, you know, we've seen that when large housing complexes have started out the main day event with the red Solo Cup parading up and down campus with signs to come to their place, and then they wonder why they have an unruly event. That to me seems very different than a landlord who hasn't had any problems that suddenly has an event somewhere. So, you know, I do think that that needs to play a factor, and we have landlords who sometimes end up with tenants that can be problematic, but they work with the town, they work with us to try to educate and try to find resolution. And I think that that's I think that those are two very different scenarios.
And there are also things that landlords that can do, and many landlords in this town already do, to mitigate that kind of responsibility, like having their own you know, language written into their leases with their tenants that they will hold them responsible financially for, you know, any police activity or gatherings, or right. So it seems like it's giving, to me, I mean, it's a little bit complicated because it's just a draft and it's a lot of ideas in one place, but it seems like it's trying to give the town and landlords a lot of opportunities, a lot of tools to use, and focusing on education and collaboration, but with the ability to be punitive if it's necessary.
So one thing I caught in all of my language, you saw me say this is about concepts, and one concept that we had in the original revision to the police fee schedule that didn't make it into the disorderly property piece is the idea that it's a returning within 24 hours or 180 days if they have a subsequent event. So when you look at, for example, the town getting called to a Halloween event at a large housing complex, and they're given a warning and we don't have to go back, the way the ordinance had originally been revised would allow us to go back if we went back within 6 months with one of those large scale responses, we would be able to charge for that.
Do councilors have any other questions or comments before we move on?
Megan,
Yes.
I don't know why this thing isn't turning, but it's not seeming to be working. I'm thinking about the emails we received from a dozen or more residents of Webster Side. And I'm wondering, a couple of them did mention the fact that they were concerned about absentee landlords. And at least 2 of them commented on the fact that they thought Orono resident landlords were being quite responsible. Do we have a sense of absentee landlords in that area versus resident landlords?
You mean like a percentage of the rental properties that are one versus the other? I don't know off the top of my head. We could look through the rental registration though, and sort of break down the rental properties in an existing, in an established neighborhood, or
yeah. That'd be interesting. I also think in that chart that we got of police response, I also wonder in that chart whether it's resident or absentee landlord. There were a number of addresses that popped up I guess continuously is an exaggeration, but multiple times. So it would be interesting to see how that worked. To kind of going back to Laura's comment, are we getting to the problem that citizens are bringing to us? I'm not saying we're not, I'm just not sure.
Sure, I could, yeah, I could cross-reference the the reported disorderly events to the type of owner, or whether there's a local property manager. Yeah, that should be doable.
I looked up a couple of them by address, because you can do that with the reassessment information, revaluation information. And, a lot of them were a limited liability corporation, which I have no idea whether they have an agent or not. And then several of them were out of the area.
Sure.
Yeah, I guess I think we need to take a closer look at the data, as Tom is saying, and layer in like a map of, particularly of that website neighborhood, and see like, what does this neighborhood look like, and what are the goals that we have for the success of that neighborhood in our community. What we heard today from residents, I think some of whom are in council chambers right now, is that there's a lot of concerns, and that there's a lot of, lifestyle conflicts that are occurring. And while we are in a college town, I think we need to balance and weigh out where those conflicts are best occurring and where they're not. And if you look at the maps of particularly that neighborhood, the percentage of rentals is extremely high. And how do we find a balance where we can have our properties being invested in and taken care of, and not being a drain on our police resources, and successful schools? So if we could look at maps, if we could look at police calls, if we could look at where those rental properties are owned, I think out of town property management would be useful information to layer in, not just the owners, but where the property management is, for a deeper conversation about the issues that neighborhoods are experiencing and how we can address those.
All right, so it sounds like we might be ready to move on to item B on the agenda, which is comprehensive plan goals related to housing and neighborhoods. As you'll notice on the agenda, there are Roman numerals 1 through 5 here. And I believe Kyle has some slides to kind of go through them. Just for, meeting flow and organizational purposes, I'm going to ask that counselors don't interrupt or ask questions during the slides. We can go back to them and ask questions. But I think that my understanding is that the way that these slides have been developed, questions that you might have during the presentation could very easily be answered or addressed by the last slides. So I am going to ask that folks just have a listen and hold questions and comments until the end of the 5 items. Kyle?
Sure, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Can everyone see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. All right, so this is kind of to start a bigger conversation in regards to housing and sort of neighborhoods within the town, how the comp plan addressed some of these topics, and then moving forward, kind of looking at where to go next and some of the concerns that have been identified. So first, we've been over most of these before. They've been in the comp plan for the past 6 years now, but we can just kind of briefly get a recap of some of the issues and opportunities in the comprehensive plan identified around housing were the decline in family-aged households, creating opportunities for development of affordable home ownership, near services. And then, as we were kind of just talking about, balancing that with the large college-age population that is a useful presence and a mark of a university town. So striving to integrate university students into town life and improving the town so that it appeals more to students. Another goal or opportunity was integrating off-campus student housing into existing neighborhoods. It moved on to sort of then talk about more of the aging population in, how that we as a town had an increase from 2000 to 2010 in a population over 65 and 75 years old, making sure that adequate housing and services was provided for that group. And then, finally, the big issue identified in that section of the comp plan was a gap in housing for low and moderate income households. And it kind of goes on to talk about seeking to achieve at least 10% of new or renovated housing stock to be affordable to households with under 80% of the region's median income, and at least 20% of that newer renovated housing stock being affordable to those between 80 and 120% of the region's median income. So those were the main kind of housing topics brought up in the comp plan. Some of the things since then the council has implemented. One of the, I think, earlier changes was the idea, there was a recommendation to kind of expand what the town considers for accessory dwelling units. So the council had amended the standards in the ordinance for ADUs to allow them in detached accessory structures on the property. This is still an option now. I think it's a fairly underutilized option. Honestly, this is basically eligible for anyone with, above an 8,000 square foot lot with a owner occupied single family home. They could build a structure in their backyard of up to 500 square feet and create a kind of small scale rental opportunity. This was kind of directly aimed at addressing, providing more rental opportunities that would help integrate small scale student rentals within the town with nearby owner occupants. There are some cases of people doing this in town, but yeah, I think it could still be expanded. Next was a couple of the recent amendments that the council adopted, establishing the Village Residential Overlay District, which incentivizes home ownership and also incentivizes creating rental opportunities with owner occupants in an attached unit, and then also reducing the minimum lot size and frontage requirements in the MDR district, which was aimed at allowing the development for slightly smaller lot sizes than what were previously allowed in the medium density residential district. Those were both really aimed at that gap in low and moderate income households and the I think decline in family aged households, and saying that young families at the time of the comp plan weren't necessarily meeting that median income threshold to afford the average home in Orono. So let's find a way to create conditions where more affordable homes could be developed through smaller lots and those sorts of things. Right before I started in Orono, the council was going through adopting property maintenance standards and an amendment to the existing standards in the ordinance that kind of clarified and improved on some of the language there for taking care of the external property yards to make sure properties were being maintained adequately. One of the another change, I think before my time, was that the council adopted a definition of house guest, which was a recommended kind of change from the comp plan. And it specifically aimed at kind of addressing the issue that I think code enforcement and town staff had when trying to determine the number of unrelated people in a dwelling unit. When they would respond to a complaint or something like that, and they're trying to figure out, okay, there's 3 unrelated, 4 unrelated, however many people here, and the response from a property owner could be, well, that's just a guest, they're just staying or visiting. That definition was really to clarify what a house guest versus a resident in a dwelling unit is. The comp plan recommended a continuation of allowing cluster development standards, specifically in the MDR and C2 districts, using that to provide housing at suitable residential densities. That was, I think, specifically recommended to cater towards that additional housing for the aging population groups. The cluster development allows for a bit more flexibility in the layout of the development, which can often be more walkable and the units closer together than just individual lots with single family homes on them. And then finally, the town had sort of tried this final bullet point where consider on a case-by-case basis requests to establish affordable housing TIF districts when proposed subdivisions will include at least 1/3 affordable units. And that approach was used with the Webster Point subdivision. Okay, so moving on now to kind of taking a look at just some kind of high-level, high-view data and just some things to keep in mind as we move on in the presentation. I have not kind of dived deeply into new census data for housing. This is meant more as just kind of a general overview. But when we get to the next steps, we can talk more about some of that. But yeah, this is kind of to show from 2000 to 2010, the town saw a growth in the number of housing units by about 200 units, a little under. I think Orchard Trails would have played a role in that number, a pretty substantial chunk of that 190 units. Looking at the census data from 2020, it appears that we've added a lot more housing in the last 10 years than the 10 years before that, a little over 700 units. So again, a pretty sizable chunk of that 700 would be units in the AV and the reserve. That would total over 400 units just in those 2 complexes. But I think it still shows that more housing has been added even when you take away the development of those big apartment complexes in the last 10 years than the 10 years between 2000 and 2010. And sort of looking through recent building permit data through our code enforcement tracking, and just sort of anecdotally speaking more, building permits for residential dwellings in the last year or two have really started to pick up versus the few years before that. So in 2017 to 2019, there were between 1 and I think 3 permits for new homes being pulled those few years. There were a lot of subdivisions that had previously been approved that were not having homes built on those lots. That seems to be turning around now, where in 2021, we've already had over 10, I think, building permits, and a couple of them are 2-family homes. And we also have a kind of a small scale subdivision going ahead with the planning board right now that would, probably add a few more units to that number as well. And then the second half of the slide, I really just wanted to kind of make the point that, with our existing layout of the town, legally non-conforming grandfathered residential uses are a thing that exists in our neighborhoods, specifically in the MDR district. And this is really, broken down into 2 types. The medium density residential district allows currently single and 2-family homes. It doesn't allow multi-family structures, which are 3 units or more in a single structure. Okay, but we know that in this district, those types of structures exist because they existed when the use was allowed, or when they were permitted to create those, and they've become legally non-conforming. And so long as they continue to operate, they're allowed to continue to operate. And looking at some data not specific to the MDR, but just in the town as a whole, there are 449, this was 2012 data, so there are probably more now, 449 2 to 4 unit structures per the comp plan. So that's not really looking at those large scale, apartment complexes on Park Street. This is more looking at, in the neighborhoods at that scale. That's a fairly substantial number of structures in our residential districts that are in that 2 to 4 unit range. So this type of activity exists in the town, and has existed there on some level for a while. But to kind of add on to that, the MDR also has a number of legally non-conforming lots, which are non-conforming due to not meeting minimum lot size requirements. So we talked about this a lot in the village residential overlay discussion, when we were talking about minimum lot size and things like that, we lowered the minimum lot size in the MDR from 20,000 to 15,000 square feet, but that there were still, certain neighborhoods specifically, that were created with smaller lot sizes of between 5 and 10,000 square feet. And then that those exist throughout the MDR district. So that's really just to keep in mind as we kind of move into the next slide and take a look at some of the concerns that staff has kind of found when considering Orono's housing. Okay. So first thing I kind of want to talk about is, the concern when looking at our current housing situation in the town is the lack of residential subdivisions in the town's growth area. And this was something that was mentioned in the comp plan, and it's still true now. Between 2000 and 2010, there were, some subdivisions in the low density district and the forest and agriculture district, the typical dead end street type subdivisions with larger lots, because those districts are designed to be less dense. but the town hasn't seen many, bigger subdivisions within the growth area in the MDR district, the village commercial, the commercial too. This is where the town has identified that we should be focusing growth to prevent sprawl, to increase walkability, all of those things that we like to talk about on a regular basis. And there's a number of reasons as to why that could be happening. One is the infrastructure costs associated with developing an entire new subdivision. Two is our density allowances. Cluster development allows for slight increases in our allowed density, but even that comes with different things that a developer is then required to do. I mean, first of all, cluster development is only eligible for lots bigger than 3 acres. So when you're talking about smaller scale development, it doesn't really come into play. But there's certain amounts of open space you have to provide, and the number of units, for instance, in the MDR, per acre, it still comes out to, you can basically have 1 unit for every 10,000 square feet of, lot area, which we know there are existing lots, in the MDR district in neighborhoods that people in town enjoy that are already lower than that. Next is environmental concerns. Certain undeveloped portions of land that could otherwise be used for subdivisions have, they could be in the shoreland zone area. They could have vernal pools on them. There could be any number of sort of environmental conditions that make it difficult for a developer to actually go in and develop it. Whereas if the land was all buildable, it would be a much easier process. And finally, is existing neighborhood pushback. And this is something that I think can be seen at every level of development, residential development, specifically in the town. I think from larger scale subdivisions all the way down to adding a few housing lots in an existing neighborhood to building 1 home on already established street. I think staff at different levels gets comment from public, from neighborhoods, that oftentimes raises concerns about new residential development for a number of reasons. And this is something that affects developers when they're looking to come in and potentially create new housing in the town. The next thing I want to talk about, I think, is the most important thing for us to consider. And I think that a lot of this is true for our ordinance. And it's the idea of exclusionary zoning. Exclusionary zoning is the idea that you can use zoning as a way to exclude certain land uses. So that's sort of the highest level. Where the problems really start to come in, because you think, that's the whole point of zoning, right? Is to allow certain land uses and not allow others. Going back to the early days of zoning, you wanted to protect people from a factory being next to a residential neighborhood. But when that starts to be used to limit and create very specific standards, you start to alienate and exclude certain groups from living in certain places. So all of these bullet points sort of go into creating an environment of exclusion in a certain zoning district. So I think first is high minimum lot sizes make it difficult to provide multi-unit residential uses. So in our commercial 2 district, which is supposed to be a mixed use district, it's supposed to be walkable, it's adjacent to the university. You know, we have some of these, you know, large apartment complexes there. But to do one of those cluster developments, again, you need a lot of land, and our minimum lot size in the C2 is 40,000 square feet, so almost an acre. And the minimum lot size per family is 15,000 square feet. So for a 3-unit building, which multifamily is allowed in the C2, for a 3-unit building, you would need over an acre of land, which doesn't create an environment of walkability. It doesn't create an environment where developers would want to go in and think it's worth it to create a new multi-unit structure. And it doesn't create an environment where you can attract people looking for affordable rental opportunities, because if you can only build 3 units on an acre, even if you can find a lot there to do that, which is probably going to be a difficult ask, then each of those 3 units would probably be priced so high and designed to house students, because you know you can put more unrelated people in there and charge them each a certain amount to make it worth the developer's cost. Whereas if you allowed a higher density there, you allowed more units to go into that multifamily structure, maybe you get smaller units, the studios, the 1-bedrooms, things like that. So while you had more units, there were less people in each one, or they were more affordable units, because the developer could be making the money on the scale of the total number of units versus the number of people going into a single unit. Second thing is the idea of multifamily dwellings of any scale not being allowed in the MDR district. Touched on it before. The MDR district is a zone that allows single family and 2-family dwellings. However, for a 2-family dwelling, you need to double the minimum lot area. So yes, you allow 2-family dwellings, but it's fairly difficult, as you need 30,000 square feet after our recent ordinance amendment to allow that 2-family. Single family zones that are primarily single family, you know, by their nature, whatever the lot size is, are generally considered in the planning world to be exclusionary, because you're not allowing anyone who's interested in a housing opportunity that's not a single family home on a 15,000 square foot lot to live there. So there are instances, you know, going back to the last slide, of multi-unit structures, 3 units, 4 units existing in the MDR. You know, we have a lot of large structures in our MDR. You know, and when we talk about young families or young professionals wanting to move to the town, well, I don't think a lot of young professionals looking for an affordable housing opportunity are necessarily going to want to move into a several thousand square foot single family home with a big yard and lot area. That doesn't create an affordable housing situation. So beyond creating, you know, less, you know, high minimum lot sizes, you know, allowing multifamily dwellings, you know, and we touch on this with accessory dwelling units, right? The idea of, you know, you have a single family home. Well, now we say an accessory dwelling unit is okay. But we know that in town, specifically in certain neighborhoods, there are more non-conforming uses where you see some of these 3-4 unit buildings that might be the same size as someone else's single family home. So from a physical aesthetic appearance, it could be the same structure. It's just that it's used to create, multiple units. It could be multiple 1-bedroom units or multiple 2-bedroom units or multiple studios. Whereas, you could have a 2,000-3,000 square foot single family home that was just used for that one family. If we want to promote walkability and promote sustainability and building off of our existing infrastructure, then I think it's something very much worth considering, using our existing infrastructure and our existing housing stock to create more housing opportunities. Moving on to the next point, zoning only for residential uses. Oh, sorry, I skipped one. The HDR district. So the town has an HDR district. We talk a lot about the MDR because that's the most widely zoned sort of residential area. But there is an HDR, and that HDR district does allow multifamily, and it has, a little less of a minimum lot size requirement of 10,000 square feet with 5,000 square feet per dwelling unit. So, there's the potential for more 2-family, small scale multifamily structures. But the thing is, we don't really utilize that zone. There are only a select few properties in the town that are actually zoned that way. Places like Dryden Terrace, Webster Point, very specific instances where it's used. That, if that were to be expanded or considered to be expanded, that would have the potential of opening up existing residential areas to kind of be built up more and create more housing opportunities. Moving on, zoning for only residential uses. So again, we talk a lot about walkability, creating safe neighborhoods where people can walk around and be outside and do all of those things. And you create that that close-knit community feel. But the thing is, what our current zoning doesn't take into consideration in all areas is that no matter how dense you make a residential area, if you can only go from one street of houses to another street of houses, that's not really walkable. Walkability is the relationship between where people live and things they can access. So it relies on businesses, services, those sorts of things. So that's why, when we talked about the Village Residential District, we were talking about the area around downtown, because that area, you have access to those certain services and businesses. So it becomes more walkable. But as you break away from that downtown area, you get less and less mixed use zoning, less and less, non-residential uses. And the Main Street, office overlay was originally designed to sort of help in that regard. But that also, going back to, some of the items that we talked about before, never really reached its full potential, where it's only now eligible for offices instead of something like small scale retail or things like that, which would help to create, more walkability along Main Street, because there would be more things for people to access, more services for them to utilize. And finally, my last point here on this topic is the idea of prohibiting certain groups from certain zoning districts. The idea that you can tell a certain group of people specifically that they can't live in a zoning district, even though they abide by the same rules that any other people do, is, you know, in my planning profession opinion, inherently exclusionary. You know, the idea of regulating student homes, there was a court case in the early 70s in which there was a local ordinance that regulated the number of homes, regulated the number of people in a home based on whether they were students or not. A group challenged it at that time. The court held that it was okay for a local, you know, municipality to make a rule like that. That zoning was allowed to protect the general interest and safety of the public, that if there was a reason to do it, that was okay. And I think that was the basis for why that recommendation was put in the comprehensive plan for the town council to consider. Because there were some other examples of communities that had done something similar, and going back to a couple of those court cases, you know, they found that it was acceptable for a municipality to do that. But because something is acceptable at the court level, doesn't mean it is an ethically inclusionary zoning practice by the town. And just as, you know, for years in planning circles, people would consider zoning districts that were exclusively single-family homes an exclusionary practice because you're limiting people of lower incomes who might be looking for small-scale rental properties in an apartment type setting or things like that. I don't see a way in which regulating an entire population, specifically on the way that we've currently defined student homes, isn't exclusionary. Because the way we've currently defined it, you could have 3 21-year-olds who weren't students living in a home, and that seems like it would be a perfectly acceptable practice. When I think really the issue there is a behavioral one, which is by, you know, a select few you know, parties that we've, you know, I think as that data had shown with the disorderly events, has sort of been trending to less violations over the years, and that we are trying to address in a number of other ways and practices through the town, and that's separate. An occupancy of a residential use is not something that should be zoned. Zoning is generally held for land uses and structures. When you start getting into regulating what type of people can occupy one of those residential structures, that's when it starts to become exclusionary. And I think in general, we've recognized that in a number of other situations when it comes to race, when it comes to economic class. So I'm not quite sure the logic of, you know, not applying that to students here. So the last point of concern I'd bring up in this area is the need for infill development. And infill development is sort of like I was talking about before, just building off of our existing infrastructure. As I had mentioned, you know, there are a lot of larger scale single family homes currently, specifically in our MDR district, that could be potentially divided if certain minimum lot size requirements, specifically minimum lot area per family, were amended that could provide, more affordable opportunities for people either to rent. It could be for students, it could be for that aging population that the comp plan talked about. It could be for new professionals looking to move into the town because they want to rent before they can start buying something. It could be for a homeowner who is okay buying a home if they have the ability to make some money renting out a couple units within the home. That, as we're not seeing a lot of larger scale new residential subdivisions, that idea of infill development becomes increasingly more important, I think. So with all that, the identified next steps, I think for staff is to, one, provide better information and outreach in regards to our existing opportunities, whether it's accessory dwelling units, the Village Residential Overlay District that was just enacted, or other things, creating some infographics, some visuals that can be posted on the town website to, really find people who are interested in doing those sorts of things and making the process easily understandable for them. A thorough review and analysis of the 2020 census housing data, comparing that to the comp plan. Preliminary review, looking at things like median income, what median family income, things like that, as it was reported in the comp plan, are much different now. So I'd be interested in kind of taking a look at that and seeing whether the same problems that were identified in the comp plan are actually still the problems that the market's currently facing. Discussing with other town staff the feasibility of rezoning or upzoning certain areas. This is purely on the feasibility level. Can the infrastructure in certain areas of town handle, new development, adding in new units, traffic impacts, what would have to happen to roads, what upgrades have to happen, what traffic patterns have to change, things like that. To see where potentially, if the town wants to provide more housing opportunities for whoever it wants to attract, whether it's young families, low income, whoever it is, if there needs to be additional housing opportunities to create more supply, to lower prices, to create more affordability, those units have to be put in somewhere. So infill development and finding the feasible areas around town where that development could happen and best happen would be an important step. And then finally, reviewing best practices from other communities for incentivizing specifically affordable housing units using density or use bonuses for a certain amount of affordable units. So this could be, creating specific standards for subdivisions. If you add in X number of affordable units at this level of affordability, whether it's that under 80%, 80 to 120%, whatever it is, you get Y bonus, whether it's an increase in density, multifamily becomes allowed, whatever it is. So that would be a way to target specific populations and incomes and kind of affordability classes versus just applying something across the board. I know that this was a little bit different than some of my other presentations, but I feel like these are things that had to be brought up, and I'm happy to take any feedback and hear any other steps and direction that the council wants to go, on this topic going forward.
Thank you, Kyle. So, we've been working our way through a lot of related pieces of this larger issue for quite a while. And I think, my sense and the sense that I get from staff is just that we have been kind of spinning in circles. And I think that the goal, you know, coming out of this meeting is to clarify, solidify kind of a direction of tangible steps. I think one of the issues is we are very well aware of the problems, right? Of the things people are experiencing as they live here in this community, particularly the way that people are negatively impacted by some things that might be happening in our neighborhoods. But we also haven't clearly identified an issue that there isn't already a tool to address that we need to kind of move forward on. So I guess that what I would hope for the comments and discussion that will happen now from counselors is that we can give staff some sort of tangible direction of what we really want to focus on moving forward. Does anybody want to jump in?
I really appreciate the way that Kyle has laid out the issues, and it sounds like there's a very clear presentation of what the staff, we could encourage the staff to be doing to assist us to address these issues. So I guess I support what he wrote there in his, like, evaluating rental properties now and how things have changed since with new census data, and certainly this issue that if we prohibit large buildings that could be subdivided from being subdivided as we do now through our zoning, even though in those very same zoning areas, we have buildings that have been subdivided that it would not necessarily hold up in court as an acceptable, the practices that we have are not necessarily acceptable because they're exclusionary.
I just have a question about Lori's comment. Kyle, is that what you were trying to say? That I guess I had a different interpretation, that because units are multi-unit rentals, it's exclusionary, that they're not multifamily? Like,
No, what I heard him say is that if you have a large single family home and it's zoned that you cannot subdivide it, that's actually not defensible because there are other units in the same zone that were subdivided before we changed the rules. And so if you owned a large single family home and you wanted to subdivide it, and by subdividing it, you would make it available to people who are lower income than can afford the huge single family home. Right now, our zoning says that you could not do that, but he's saying that there are court cases saying that that's exclusionary. You know, that not poor people.
So let me try to clarify. So there are existing non-conforming multifamily homes in the MDR. Those are allowed to continue to exist as they are. I think the fact that we have single family homes that can't become multifamily homes right now, that's okay. There are no court cases that would overturn that aspect of it. What I was trying to say is that we have these existing structures in these areas, and that what the exclusionary practice is the idea of solely single family residential districts in general. I don't think it's illegal for us to have single family zoning. Lots of places do, but a lot of places are starting to get rid of those types of zoning districts because they've recognized that it creates a number of problems when it comes to housing opportunities and affordable housing opportunities, and that transitioning certain areas, identified in certain ways, into more inclusive zones where you have single, two-family, smaller scale multifamily, that creates more housing opportunities in those areas. It creates more housing opportunities for different types of people to move in that might not have been able to afford living in a zoning district that was solely single family home. So it's not that it's illegal for the town to do it or that we would be in jeopardy of some court ruling keeping things the way it is. But I think as an ethical practice, the planning world is moving away from that sort of opinion, I think.
And Kyle, I think that you said something that was a really great point to add on to this discussion, which is the housing has to go somewhere. So if our goal, you know, obviously student rentals or just rental units in general are more profitable for landlords than renting to a one income or two income family. That is what the market is. That is the market here. And the rental industry and student housing is a vital part of our economy. However, we do need more housing units, but as Kyle said, they do have to go somewhere. And so I think what I took away from that presentation discussing zoning, rezoning and upzoning is that if there's a lot of pushback around development, cluster development or new development in neighborhoods, the other alternative or a companion alternative is to discuss how we zone some of the already pretty dense areas of town. Laura, did you want to go into a comment or discussion or something from that question, or?
Yeah, I guess I would like the council to have everybody present and have kind of a deeper conversation on like what we're recommending. The recommendations that I see here are like, I think we need that data review. And then I think advertising the ADUs is fine. But I think we're forgetting about like the existing neighborhoods where we know there's struggles. And I guess I'm reading into, I think, what was the exclusionary zoning piece. I think there's an ethical conversation there that staff was maybe expressing a concern about that council needs to discuss and come to an opinion on, because I think there are different perspectives when you talk about prohibiting certain groups from certain zoning districts is a pretty heavy statement. And I think that there's a range of, when we talk about a desired quality of housing, is different than prohibiting a certain group from being in a zoning district. And so I think there are neighborhoods where we can talk about quality of housing that may influence behaviors in those neighborhoods. And I want to be really careful about how we're classifying that, and would love to hear from all of council on that. So I guess I would, yes, let's talk about zoning and what we can do to encourage some redevelopment. But I'm almost more concerned about our current neighborhoods and how we address those and what's going on there. And I think there's a level of enforcement that needs to happen. I also think there's regulation around parking spaces and assuring the number of people that live there is actually being followed, and the upkeep of the property. So those are some next steps that I would recommend. And then what staff has here would be interesting. And I think we need to talk about some of them more.
Tom, did you have anything to add?
I'm very interested in affordable housing for young families or young professionals in Orono. And I realize that it's very difficult for young folks, young professionals to find affordable housing in the community. And I am very interested in exploring how we incentivize development of that kind of housing. I'm much more interested in that kind of housing than some of the other housing options personally.
Sorry, who was?
I do think that the discussion with entire council is an important one, and and some of the additional data that Kyle is going to be working on is going to be an important part of that discussion. And I really appreciate the work that you've done in outlining these steps and these concerns, Kyle. I think this is pointing us in a very positive direction.
Sure.
So for my takeaway from all of this, I think, and I until a few years ago, I lived in the Webster Side neighborhood. I'm intimately familiar with the challenges that neighborhood and neighborhoods like that are facing in the town. But I think that for me, one of the things that has made this process really difficult, especially recently in the last few comp plan committee meetings where we have discussed rental properties and housing stock, what's difficult for me is that I feel like on council and also with the public, there's a lot of intertwining of two things that might be distinct. And on the one hand, as I see it, we have behavior, and on the other side, we have housing stock. And although sometimes it can be tempting to conflate or to overlay some of those concerns, I feel, for me, I feel like that has been a roadblock to our ability to really move forward, because it can be very frustrating. I say this as a former Webster Side resident. It can be really frustrating when you're living that, and when you're a counselor and you're hearing from people who are living that. And I am not minimizing those concerns at all. But when we talk about how to address some of the issues, I think that issues around our housing market and our housing stock, and issues around the impactful behaviors that we're seeing in neighborhoods could be better tackled if we keep those things distinct as much as possible. And so for me, when I think about next steps and pointing staff in a direction, I think that, for me, the most immediate concern is what is most immediately concerning residents whose lives might be impacted negatively by behaviors in certain neighborhoods. And for me, that means focusing on the ordinance revisions that we were kind of looking at, that draft language tonight. I think that those fee structures, the education, the involvement of landlords and trying to bring them on as a collaborative part of the process of fixing these issues, focusing on that could really alleviate a lot of the concerns that residents are having in the immediate right now on the ground. But in addition to that, another thing that we, thinking about looking at that data around the complaints that we've received or that the town's received, I think another thing that's really important to drive home is that we do have a lot of, whether it's everything from health and safety concerns on property maintenance to multiple people living in a house that shouldn't be living there, to parties or other neighborhood disruptions, running stop signs. All of these things can be reported to the town, and different offices of the town can do something about those things. And I think one of the issues too is that that I hear frustration from staff is that they're not getting all of that information from the public. They're hearing about it maybe after the fact when we have policy discussions around housing. And so I think that there are things we could do around education and making it more accessible on our website for kind of like tying into our community policing program of, a neighborhood issue tip line, so that people, when it's not a loud party that you'd call the cops for, but other issues that arise in the neighborhood, like, well, lots of things, that you could call the town and let them know that there's an issue, and the town could decide what the appropriate staff or department to send or to look at that issue would be. And I think that would also help. So for me, the most immediate concerns would be like, what's impacting the residents who are living through things that they may not want to be living through. And I think that this ordinance work and working on the ability to kind of encourage those calls and tips about stuff that's going on in neighborhoods so that we can send code enforcement or we can send community policing out to try to deal with that would be most important. And then, you know, secondary to that, focusing on the housing stock and the housing market. So new development and how we can look at upzoning, rezoning, cluster development to create more housing stock because, you know, clearly there's a need for that, but housing stock that is affordable for maybe not students, but you know, that can kind of broaden the housing stock so that we have room for lots of student rentals and also rentals that might be appropriate for other folks. So that's kind of where I'm at. I don't know. I mean, it sounds like folks are generally supportive of staff's recommendations as Kyle went over them.
Megan, I like your prioritizing. I think that you have that correct, and that we ought to focus our energy first on these ordinance changes and make sure we get what we really want in there.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Sorry, there's background noise. So can you repeat the prioritization? So it was the ordinances and then what? Like, I'm not clear where we're landing as a wrap up to this meeting of recommendations.
I mean, that was just my 2 cents. My 2 cents is that focusing immediately on the things that are most concerning to residents who are lodging complaints would mean working on those ordinance revisions so that we can address the behaviors that are happening in the neighborhoods. The flip side of that is figuring out more ways to encourage residents to come to the town staff with behavior issues in neighborhoods before it escalates to the level of calling your counselor so that they can talk about it during a policy discussion, which unfortunately has been happening. And which is, you know, not a criticism of the residents or of council, but just that's an inefficient way to address a problem that can be addressed at the staff level. So figuring out a way to, whether it's through education, whether it's through greater accessibility on the website, the community policing division, figuring out ways to get those complaints heard by staff at the staff level so they can be addressed appropriately, whether it's rotting stuff on somebody's lawn that's a rodent harborage that should be addressed by code enforcement, but code enforcement is only going to address it if the complaint is called in. Does that make sense?
Okay, I guess from a policy perspective, I think there are some enforcement, I mean, there's some staff level enforcement though that could be used to enforce some of the policies that we do have in place. And I think that's the challenge. And so,
sorry, can you clarify what you mean by that? Are you saying that staff shouldn't be complaint driven, or are you saying that we need different policies, or I'm not clear?
No, I'm saying that we have policies in place around the number of residents, and I'm adding, as a part of this meeting, I think we should have conversations around parking that go into rental units and having the availability of the parking off street and the level of enforcement that goes into that. And yes, having some like auto thing on the website to log complaints for staff seems like a good idea also.
Yeah, I mean, I guess why I asked you to clarify that, Laura, is code enforcement is complaint driven because we don't have the staff or the budget to have code enforcement go out seeking code violations to uncover. So, our code enforcement officer working real hard as it is. So it's a complaint-driven system. And I think the feedback I'm hearing from staff over these years is that they're not hearing from the public about a lot of these issues. The public isn't calling in and telling staff like, hey, there's 10 people living in this apartment next door to me. So we have a complaint-driven system. And unless we were going to expand that department and fund it significantly, we would not be able to move to a system where the town is going out to enforce the code because it's looking for code violations. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I just think we need to have the options on the table. And as we think about where we are going to invest our resources and money, we are thinking about what can be done in current neighborhoods, not just incentivizing, which is going to cost money, incentivizing new developments. You have to find a balance between that, because we know that we want that development to be closer into the services. And that's where a lot of development already exists. So I think we need to just talk about this some more as a whole council, like what we're trying to achieve and what all the options are with some additional data.
I mean, I think there could be value in talking about and like looking at the data during a workshop. And I know that there might be other counselors who would like to weigh in, but in terms of digging through ordinances and the work that we're doing in this committee, I mean, we work in committee for a reason, and this work lives in this committee. And the only committee member who wasn't present tonight is Cheryl because she was ill. So, you know, I do think there's value in looking at that data and talking about very big picture, broad strokes stuff at a workshop. But the progress on this work to me really feels like it should live in the committee. And then when we get to a point that we might need to kind of hear from all of council on a specific issue to then bring, you know, elevate that to workshop. That's the process we normally follow. I'm comfortable with that process. Again, reiterating, I'd like all of council to be able to hear about this data of, you know, absentee landlords and how different neighborhoods are kind of looking in that regard. But in terms of the work of the committee, I think that the work lives in the committee. And anyone's welcome to attend the committee meeting if they are interested. Well, it seems like we do have a consensus that addressing, you know, doing the things that would address the behaviors is an important point of focus moving forward. And if there isn't anything else from folks, we may move on to a town manager's update. Thank you so much, Kyle.
No.
It's late, so council's going to be gathering again on Thursday. Most counselors will be in council chamber for a socially distanced workshop, just a training. I will provide some information. We have a pending email that went out to council from Dan LaPointe. I have talked to the town attorney and I'm doing a little bit of research, but will respond to that. I've talked to Council Chair Perry, and the goal is that we'll get that done tomorrow. Next, so Thursday, we're meeting here at 3:30 to 5:30. I'm still trying to finagle a little bit of consultant time after the training. If I'm able to do that, I will feed you, I promise. Following Monday, the 4th, we are going to have all committees. And at this point, I think there will be something for all committees, not just one. And I will give you an update on some information that we have received from the Municipal Review Committee about some potential action that they're looking to take and get some feedback on whether or not we want to take any action. Other than that, I'm just trudging through the end of the audit, which I think went well. Tom's nodding. He met with the auditor last.
And Megan.
And Megan. So other than that, I'm just kind of making my way through. And next meeting, we're going to have Tom sit here because this is where Owl resets to, and Tom should be on camera and not me.
Laura?
I do think if we're doing the hybrid meetings, that having people in the room log in separately would make hearing people and engaging go much better. It's doable.
Okay, so I think that brings us to the close. I want to reiterate and thank all of the residents, landlords, some landlords who are also residents who sent messages, who met with town staff, who gave feedback for us to consider. I also want to, again, remind folks that, you know, if you're living in a neighborhood and there's something going on that's probably not supposed to be going on, you can call town staff and they will send the appropriate, or they'll send it to the appropriate department to look into it. So if you're living next door to 17 kids crammed into an apartment, let the town know so they can look into that. All right, so with that, I will take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
And Laura, you'll have to second. Oh, we lost her. Okay, well, I guess I will adjourn this committee meeting. Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.